This is Sam Black with Drafting Archetypes, and today I'm going to be discussing white-black in Aetherdrift. As always, the notes are available to follow along at patreon.com/draftingarchetypes. White-black is the third worst performing color pair in this format, behind white-red and white-blue. It's also the least drafted color pair. White is very clearly the weakest color, but the good news is that it is generally not very contested. So the few good white cards that exist, you can often find multiple copies of if you're willing to play white. But on the other hand, this is already the least drafted color pair and still performing near the bottom, so it's not like you can expect it to get much more open and start doing better or anything. This is just kind of its place in the format. I do think that it's not as bad as it looks. I think that it's a bit tricky to draft. I think that there are a lot of... It's the kind of archetype that's honestly a perfect trap for me, where it's easy to obsess over pursuing some synergies and go too far, I guess I would say. I think that you want your deck to be kind of balanced. You want, like, a good mix of early game, late game, removal, card advantage. Like, this is a kind of true mid-range deck, and I personally struggle with those. I generally like to draft decks that are pretty strategically extreme and really like lean into a synergy. And here you kind of just want something balanced. Start your engines is basically always going to matter. A lot of your best cards rely on having max speed. And so you want to prioritize some cards that start your engines, but you don't want to go crazy with it and play like a lot of surveyors or anything. As we kind of talked about on the last episode, like, the 10th start your engine card is a lot less good at getting you to max speed than getting another card that's good at making sure your opponent loses life on your turn once your engines are started. So, as far as this color pair's like strategic positioning, I think it has a lot in common with red-black, which is also like an engines deck that has like understated creatures relative to certainly the green decks, and needs to kind of figure out how it's going to like get engines on and how it's going to be able to like handle the late game. The big difference is red-black's approach to that kind of leans on the fact that red-black is very good at pushing damage outside of combat or in combat with unblockable stuff with Apocalypse Runner, the red-black uncommon vehicle. With white-black, you don't have as much like pure reach, but instead you have more flyers. And so I think you end up kind of leaning on those flyers to complete your max speed. But it's also really good to prioritize the like hard speed boosts, like the cards that don't need combat, like Pact Stall Terror, the 3 and a black 3/4 that drains your opponent when it or another artifact enters, or Risky Shortcut, 2 and a black, draw 2, each player loses 2 life. I think Risky Shortcut is kind of the secret to white-black. This is a bit of a hot take. It's not purely supported by the stats, though when I looked at top performance by top players in 17 lands, while a lot of cards, the stats are incomplete, a lot of cards don't have enough data, but Risky Shortcut was among the best performing cards. And that really checks out to me. When I was playing with white-black, I forced white-black a few times earlier today to get a feel for it, because it's basically something I've never ended up just kind of drafting naturally in the format. I think it's hard to end up here. You're kind of trying to make some, like, your cards, you need your cards to end up being more than some of their parts. You have some amount of like go wide sacrifice stuff at higher rarity, which makes it hard to rely on, but can end up being pretty good. You need to kind of believe that your speed is going to work. You kind of need a bunch of stuff to come together. But the fact that it's so open means that you actually can make that stuff come together. It's just not something that I was naturally inclined to pursue when I wasn't doing it for science. But doing it for science, it felt like there's something there. And it felt like risky shortcut is really important to making it all work. Specifically, when compared to red-black, you kind of need combat to work. Specifically, you need to be able to attack with flyers. And it's really hard to attack with flyers in this format because the Hazard of the Dunes, Migrating Ketrodon, and Thunderhead Gunner are really big, really good reach creatures. So, like, all of them that are opened are going to end up in people's decks. And they're all way bigger than the flyers. So, if one of them is in play, your flyers don't matter. They can't attack. So, if you're trying to attack with flyers, you need enough removal that you can kill the big reach creatures. The problem is, if you're white-black and you just overload on removal, then why do you not just lose to your opponent's card advantage if they're playing blue or even just red for Thunderhead Gunner, where like they don't flood out and you presumably do? And that's where I think having some risky shortcuts can really help turn your like removal into a more realistic game plan where, you know, you can actually like grind. And white-black might not have a lot of pure card draw, but it does have some card advantage if you're willing to count extra bodies, like Broadcast Rambler being the 4 and a white 5/4 vehicle that makes a 1/1 flyer. That gives you 2 bodies at a pretty good rate. Broadcast Rambler is a good card. The like exact way that it's giving you bodies is very good in white-black. Like the small flyer can help get your engines going. They're both artifacts, so it's a double trigger on Pactol Terror. The Rambler is really easy to crew, even if the Thopter dies. So that card's a very good fit. And you can get, you know, extra card advantage from your dead surveyors. You can kind of like a bunch of the uncommons are giving you card advantage. You have the Embalmed Ascendant, the 3 mana 1/2 that makes a 2/2 zombie when it enters and then becomes a Blood Artist when you have, or well, as a little Pork Cutthroat, when you have max speed. That's another 2 bodies in 1 card. Dune Drifter, the white-black uncommon vehicle, white-black X that returns something from your graveyard to the battlefield. Carrion Cruiser, I think it's called, the 3 mana 3/2 black mill 2, then return a creature or vehicle to your hand. You can get some card advantage to grind here, with or without Risky Shortcut. But I think Risky Shortcut really just helps pull it all together, and the both players lose 2 life ends up being really important when you're trying to get max speed. And I've also found just making them lose 2 life to be like, both players losing 2 life is generally going to favor you. You're playing like cheap creatures and prioritizing making your opponent lose life. So there have been some games that I played today where like I just cast Risky Shortcut to kill my opponent after like making an attack where they had a trick to stay alive, and then Risky Shortcut put them dead anyway or whatever. So I think you want to draft to try to get multiple risky shortcuts, which is very easy. Nobody else is taking them. And then draft to take advantage of that, which basically means having a lower curve, being ahead, having removal, and going a little bit lighter on the expensive stuff. Though you still want like your broadcast ramblers, and the relatively expensive flyers in white and black are pretty good. Your Swiftwing Assailant is like a card that I basically never looked at, but tried playing in white black because I was like, all right, I'm trying to get engines going. If this is a 3-mana 3/4 vigilance flyer, that's like actually pretty good. And it played really well. I did care about having the flyer. It was a pretty big body. The vigilance certainly mattered. So I like Swiftwing Assailant in white black. And then there's also the Oil Gorger is pretty good. It lets you like actually race, gives you some life gain, helps offset the life loss from stuff like Risky Shortcut, gives you more flyers. But you really can't be all in on flyers, as like my plan is just going to be to like attack with flyers unless you're very serious about having a plan for the big reach creatures. Maximum Overdrive, the 1 in a black trick that gives +1/+1 indestructible and death touch, is a really good card in the format in general. Very good in white black, a good way to get your reach creatures, your flying creatures through the reach creatures. And then obviously just like Spin Out and End of the Road are both, or sorry, Ride's End rather, the 4 in a white instant exile a creature or vehicle that you can cast for 2 mana if you're targeting a tapped creature or vehicle. So yeah, you want cheap stuff, and then like kind of whatever cheap stuff, and then evasive more expensive stuff, card advantagey more expensive stuff, removal and card advantage where you can find it, mid-range. Embalmed Descendant is really, really, really good. The drain life thing is great. Going wide itself is good. Pairs well with other stuff in white black that goes wide. Your nesting bots and ramblers and recursive stuff that get those things back. And you're going to be, you want to be drafting your deck to make the most of Embalmed Descendant regardless. Like you're trying to get your engines going. You're trying to, be good at taking advantage of having extra objects. There's kind of like a lot of different stuff going on here. I'm talking about, you want your card draw, your removal, your go wide payoffs, your like stuff dying payoffs. And often when I talk about how there are all these different things going on, I'll talk about, you want to choose a deck that's focusing on like one thing or the other, right? Like I think with red black, or red white or red blue, I talked about how you can do like lean in on the discard stuff or the exhaust stuff, and you kind of want to like figure out what you're prioritizing there. And there's like some overlap, and that's fine. And sometimes you'll do multiples, but like it's kind of better if you can focus. Here, it's hard for me, but I would advocate for not focusing. I think you want your deck to be well rounded. As far as like specific commons, the white commons you want are in order: Ride's End, the exile removal spell; Broadcast Rambler, the 5-mana vehicle that makes a 1/1 flyer; Swiftwing Assailant, the 3/3 flyer that gets +0/+1 in vigilance. And then that's it. Those are the good white commons. There are 3 of them. But then it's like okay to play like Lotus Guard Disciple, the 2 and white 2/2 flyer that gives something lifelink and indestructible when it enters. Ordinarily, I hate a Wind Drake. I'm still pretty low on Lotus Guard Disciple. I don't think I've ever actually played it. But conceptually, it makes sense in white black because often it gives you an attack where your opponent really doesn't want to block. So it gives you +1 engine when you play it, and then it's an evasive creature that can help get your engines going. The like extra damage that it pushes and the life it gains can matter here. I'd be willing to play it. And then Collision Course, the 1 in a white, destroy a vehicle or is it? I don't remember if it's vehicle or artifact. I think artifact, and then or deal damage equal to creatures you control. you're pretty good at going wide, pretty good at having things in play early, so I think it's going to be a pretty versatile removal spell. The fact that it's a sorcery makes it like not that exciting. It doesn't always do what you want. It's, not premium, but it's fine to play it. And then Leonine Surveyor, the 1 and a white, start your engines that has first strike on your turn. Good cheap way to get your engines going. Plays pretty well with stuff like Grim Javelineer that can give it extra power to get through things that your opponent thinks they're going to be able to block it with, or Maximum Overdrive. If you end up making it a larger first striking creature, it's even harder to block. So a few of those can help get your engines going, but it's not like a premium 2-drop or anything. And then, there are some other white cards that are like okay, but you'd kind of prefer not to play them, like the 2-mana 3/2 vehicle that surveils too and stuff like that. But I think these are the white cards that you're like kind of looking for, happy to play. As always, black has a ton of great commons. Like the ones that I think are better than normal are, I'd say, Engine Rat. Even though its normal is very high, it's good everywhere. It's a little bit better here because it's so good with engines. Streaking Oil Gorger, the 5-mana 3/3 flyer that has lifelink, 3/3 flying haste that has lifelink if you're at max speed. Just because you're much more of a max speed deck and you're trying to have removal, you're trying to get in with flyers, it's going to play well here. Maximum Overdrive, again, good everywhere, but kind of better here because you really want to be able to attack to get your engines going and you're playing small creatures. And, it's better when you're the aggressor and you would like to be the aggressor here. Risky Shortcut, especially, again, I think Risky Shortcut, not desirable to most decks, really good here. Mutant Surveyor, all the engine cards are a bit better here, and this can be a good way to push speed increases because of the threat to pump. And Grim Javelineer can give you attacks that you wouldn't get otherwise, plays well with evasive creatures. I do think it's really bad if your first play is Grim Javelineer, so I think you only want to play Grim Javelineer if you have like 8 or more 1 and 2 drops. So I'd say Grim Javelineer is a sometimes kind of thing. And then, I'm always highly valuing like Pact Altair, Wreckage Wicker Folk, Spin Out. Like, those are good here, good everywhere. Still, like, those are better than the stuff that's like, above how, like, those are still the best black commons. The other stuff is like, prioritize these more than other people would, but not so much that you're valuing them over the best black commons. Want to note that Nesting Bot's great. Like, it's a card that is, reads like pretty low impact, so it's hard to be sure how good it's going to be. I think it's really annoying to block a lot of the time early. Starting your engines on 1 is good. Once it becomes a 2/1, it like gets kind of real and then trades and gives you, like, you care about having the multiple objects. Just generally, like, even just like chumping block twice is pretty good. And then it plays super well with like Embalmed Descendant or the gold 3/2 that can sack a creature to surveil, and when you have max speed and a non-token dies, makes it zombie. It plays well with like Gas Guzzler. So there are like a number of rares that it's good with, and it's also just generally going to do what you want in the archetype. As far as like when and how you should end up here, I think most of the time that you'll be white-black, if it's not just literally trying it for science, is either because you opened a really, really good white-black card, or a really good white card, and then you start white. Presumably that involves like a rare, but whatever. You open a really good white card, you're white for a little while, you don't see green, maybe you don't see blue either. But, white, black, and white, blue are kind of comparable. If you're white, you should be looking to be green. White, green performs way better than the other white pairs, but you start white, black's open, green's not that hard to imagine. That would be a way to end up white, black. The other option is just you start black, that's pretty normal. There are a lot of good black cards, and then maybe black is just open, and You take a bunch of black cards before settling on a second color, and then, you get to the back half of the pack, and surprise, surprise, all the cards there are white, and some of them are like pretty reasonable, and so you just move into white black. And I think it's like pretty good to know what to look for in white black, to know when to do that if you're tabling like Rides Ends and Broadcast Ramblers, which does happen. I think moving into white black there is pretty reasonable. And that's what I have. So now gonna turn it over to Twitch chat for questions. First, as always, I want to thank the new patrons. So most importantly, thank you very much, Elliot, Chicken Enchilada, and Mar. Really appreciate the support. If anyone else is looking to support the podcast, as always, check out patreon.com/draftingarchetypes as the way to directly support, monetarily, get some benefits. But again, as I mentioned last week, anything that you feel inclined to do to spread the word, make sure that anyone you know who is playing limited or thinking about playing limited knows that this resource is available. I would like to imagine that would help them out a lot, and it would also help me. So consider that. Now, Twitch chat. Questions, comments? First up, the win rate for white black on 17 lands actually looks pretty decent, especially in the past couple of weeks. I don't know what you mean by decent. Like, it's not a disaster, but it's lower than the other 2-color pairs, especially the non-white 2-color pairs. Like, it's not winning more than other 2-color archetypes. It's winning less. But no, it's not, we're not talking about like a 49% archetype or something. Like, it's just a little bit behind. Are there any white commons or uncommons you'd ever consider first picking? Yes. I think that the links, the 1 and a white 2/3 lifelink that you mount that when saddled searches for a land is a very reasonable card to first pick. You won't always first pick it, but I think it, like if I'm opening a pack in paper and pulling the cards that I'm thinking about to the front, it's always going to end up at the front. And then, like, I'm not like eager to first pick a Ride's End, but in a weak pack, I could imagine doing it. Detention Chariot wouldn't be like an embarrassing first pick. I would kind of like hope not to first pick like a Nesting Bot, but like you could. But there's not like a long list of commons or uncommons I'm looking to first pick. Does white black need to be more conservative with removal because of reach creatures being a problem? That's going to depend more on your deck. Like, that's a question of like how much removal you have, like what your plan is. There are spots where, you're going to want to like fire off a removal spell to increase your speed, especially, if the end is in sight. Like, you're at speed 2, which is pretty easy to get to. You play a thing that starts your engines while you have a like profitable attack. Make that attack, you're at speed 2. Your opponent plays a blocker. You have a removal spell. If you use your removal spell, you connect, you get to speed 3. Now, if you have like a Pactol Terror or a risky shortcut, something like that, you're guaranteed to get to like 4 when you do that. So it's not hard to imagine a spot where just like firing off a removal spell gives you a speed increase that you can count on to get you where you need to be. And in that spot, there's a pretty good chance that I would use that, assuming that, I have a lot of reasons to care about max speed, which is how I'm drafting my white-black decks. Do you need to be conservative? Like, if you're playing against, a deck that you expect to have a big reach creature and your game plan is like all about flyers, then you might not want to kill something that can't block those flyers. But if your deck is, like 5 removal spells and 2 maximum overdrives, then you can probably afford to do it and like expect to find another. So, I would say that any deck is going to have similar considerations. Sometimes sometimes you'll want to be conservative, sometimes not. Definitely, some of your decks are going to be more set up to just like, yeah, whatever, I'm brawling on the ground, a creature's a creature. I'll kill them when I have to. I have a bunch of like broadcast ramblers or whatever that I'm trying to get in with. And others are more like, okay, I have a bunch of like Lotus Guard Disciples and Swiftwing Assailants and Oil Gorgers, and my plan is to like ignore everything that doesn't have reach. I only have like 3 removal spells. I'm going to use those on the reach creatures or whatever. So just like think about the specific nature of your deck and how you want to use your removal there. Early in the format, Untapped listed white as the worst color, followed by red. Now they're tied. Any thoughts on what might be driving that shift? I don't know that I know quite enough about how Untapped is counting that, but it's possible. Like I do think that white is more avoided than red, and that's going to make the white cards that get played perform a little bit better and the red cards perform a little bit worse. So that's gonna, that is an amount of like format adjusting that I think is within the like margin of error. Like there, the wiggle room there. It's not surprising that those would go from a little bit different to a little bit the same. And I do think that like red and white are comparable. They have like a few good commons and a lot of commons I don't really want to play, but like I could in a pinch. I think that white is a weaker color than red, but the gap isn't huge. And if red is being a lot more contested than white, it makes sense that, they'd be close, or you might prefer to be in white. White generally seems to have gotten a bump lately, I think mainly from Ride's End being very good. I would suggest that that analysis has to be incomplete. Like Ride's End has always been present and good. If you're specifically trying to account for a recent change, it's not going to be just like, oh, this card exists. It's going to be people have learned something about an archetype, or the metagame has shifted in some way. Those are basically the only likely answers, right? Either people figure out how to do something with the color that they didn't understand before, or the rest of the context changes in some way that's meaningful. I don't know what else can cause a meaningful like shift in win rate over time. And I do think, there's plenty of room for both of those to have happened. Like, figuring out, okay, there are only a few good white cards. I'll play those and ignore the other ones, and now I know which ones those are. And also, you know, most people deciding, oh, white's bad. I'm just not going to play any of these. Then the people who do want to play the, 3 good white commons get to play, 6 of those 3 commons. And then, like, they get to have, like, white as a, like, a reasonable sport color. But it's not just going to be like, yep, this card exists and therefore the win rate changed. I don't know. Ride's End is weird. Like, I like that kind of effect. I've always liked that kind of effect in every format that has it. And Ride's End is like a technically strictly better card than the similar cards that we've seen. But it was hard for me to really like get what I wanted out of it, which is weird because it's hard removal that kills big stuff in a format with a lot of big stuff and a lot of recursion, so the exile is even particularly valuable. I think mostly that's just the support. Like it's mostly just like figuring out how to play white and like the fact that white's pretty bad. And if you don't know exactly what you're doing with white, it's really easy to draft like a bad deck that Rides End can't save. And I think also like the way that I like to use those cards is often in like multicolor blue decks that really like that they can get this like cheap white removal spell on a splash. But I think this format really doesn't lend itself well to that kind of multicolor blue deck for a variety of reasons that I would say are largely centered around the mana fixing being a little bit sparse actually, and vehicles broadly. just the effective vehicles in a number of different ways, incentivizing you to play more creatures and making more powerful threats that you need to answer, making your removal sometimes line up awkwardly, kind of functioning as card advantage weirdly when they can be taken advantage of properly, and that working well against control decks in particular. Is there a viable white-black graveyard deck? Green-black is ostensibly the graveyard deck, but white has Detention Chariot and the Reanimation spell. I think that, yes, white has the Detention Chariot and the Reanimation spell, and the green-black vehicle cycles for colorless mana, so you can splash, like you can just play that in a white-black deck that's trying to like do the reanimation thing. All of the pieces for that are uncommon, so it's not going to come up a lot, but like that package can come up and you can be like pretty happy to play with it. I think that, more like white black has like a reanimation theme, like you're getting stuff back from the graveyard, you're getting some value out of stuff in the graveyard, but you're not going like heavy on the graveyard. You're not trying to play like self-mill stuff. You're never gonna play the like 6 mana 5/4 that like costs less based on stuff in the graveyard. So I don't really like, viable, like there are a lot of, that depends on what you mean by is or whatever type questions, where it's like what exactly do we mean by viable and what exactly constitutes a graveyard deck. But I would say that I would expect my white black deck to frequently interact with the graveyard in some way. I expect to have some recursion elements, but I don't expect to get a lot of value out of like, the if I'm surveilling and I put a thing in the graveyard, I expect that I'm getting a lot more value out of the card selection than the object in the graveyard. Would be my way of saying that, for a lot of like how you might be evaluating what it means for something to be a graveyard deck in terms of how it changes the value of cards, I wouldn't be thinking of white black as a graveyard deck, though I would be like, preparing for the idea that some of the value, like the card advantage type value that I'm getting, is going to come from recursion, and I'm going to have some of that. And the fact that I have some of that is going to make the like recurable high power level cards that I have a little bit more impactful. Detention Chariot's been bad for me. So much artifact removal. Yeah, your Detention Chariots don't always live, but it is like a nice versatile removal spell that, sometimes swings a game or whatever. But I don't think Detention Chariot's like a bomb or anything. I did mention that, you could first pick it. I don't think it's like a very exciting first pick. I've just played it as Abzan when I had it come together. Yeah, I think that like the dedicated, graveyard recursion type stuff is going to make more sense in base green black and can use some white. You called the fixing sparse. Would you say Aetherdrift has more or less fixing than Bloomburrow? What about Duskmourn? Bloomburrow is weird because of Fountainport Bell. Fountainport Bell, I think, is pretty good fixing that was like very underrated, and you could often get multiples, and so it meant that like the fixing was kind of more possible than it looked. And I also think that like the nature of Bloomburrow was such that people were overwhelmingly likely to try to draft 2-color pairs because of like just gravitating toward creature types as the way that they were building their decks. And so fixing there was like sparse, but kind of pretty safely available to the people who wanted it in a way that I don't think it is here, where I think it's like harder to get the fixing that exists. And Duskmourn, I'm not sure about. I think part of it is that there are a lot of pips in Aetherdrift. There's certainly some of that, like spin out being double is pretty significant. And I talked about some of that in like green black, where it's like weirdly hard to splash in green black because you have like the, triple green vanilla uncommon, and your really good uncommon vehicle is double green, double black, and you have, some other like double pips around. That varies some from like archetype to archetype. Um, but I would say less that it's like Aetherdrift has like radically like it doesn't have very much less fixing than other formats, by the numbers. Like it's more that um I think the common dual lands are actually less common than other commons, and kind of get like eaten up by people who are just like playing two color decks, and they're like, yeah, I might as well have a like gain life dual land in here. And night market's fine, pretty good, I guess, but kind of needs to do a lot of work. And then like starting column is pretty weak, and we don't have much else in the like non-land fixing department. Like, you know, you get like Ticket Tortoise and like the Mole, but like those are both kind of like soft or awkward, where like Ticket Tortoise is like only giving it to you once, and if you're on the play, it's like pretty hard to get the treasure. And like the Mole might fix, but like it's just looking at 3 extra cards, so it's not like you can't really count on that as fixing. Do you think the slower speed leads to more splashing and therefore more competition for fixing? It's a reasonable hypothesis, but I mean, that's something that you can just like look up on 17 lands, is like how often are people splashing, and I wouldn't guess that people are splashing much more in this format than others. I just think that the nature of like the quality of the fixing being kind of low and the amount of fixing being not particularly high means that like it's just pretty hard if there's competition. I have drafted 5 color with like a whole bunch of non-basic lands when that happens to be available and I happen to like be looking for it, but there are a lot of drafts where I'm like trying to draft 3 color and just see 2 pieces of fixing only, and it's like not enough that I would rather play the 3rd color than just not splash instead. Would you include pack dolls even with almost no other artifacts here? Just the ping one for speed enough? Yes. I think it's rare that you're not going to have other artifacts. Like, very rare. Like, that's kind of hard to do because a lot of the cards that you naturally want to play are artifacts. But the real question is like, or I think the meaningful aspect of this question is like, is there a number of artifacts that's too low to play it? Like, is that something that you should be thinking about? And I think basically no, just play it. Like, it's probably actually going to do more than one ping, but also just the one ping is enough. Like, being able to choose to play it on a turn when you can't otherwise increase your speed in a deck that cares a lot about that is very impactful. Could you design a white-black deck from which you would cut Pactol Terror? Yeah, I guess. But during the draft, I wouldn't expect that to be what's happening. And, certainly, like, if you play a single other artifact afterward, that's 2 speed, which is a lot of speed. Realistically, I don't see you drafting a white-black deck that doesn't have, like, 3 other artifacts. Like, how do you do that? And yeah, the threat of not activation, but like the threat of additional value is very real in terms of like your opponent assessing it as a problem and like it's just eating a removal spell or whatever. All right, that's gonna wrap us up for this week. Thanks everyone for hanging out. Thanks for listening. Thanks especially to live viewers for your questions. And I will be back next week with more Aetherdrift coverage. I do think that I probably should have wrapped up White Black before saying goodbye, but I've never been perfect at this. I do think that White Black is I think there's something there. I think it's a little bit better than it looks. I think it's pretty fun. If you haven't drafted white black, which I think a lot of people haven't, because I don't think it's like natural to find yourself in, I think it's worth looking for some opportunities to mess around with it. That's my closing thought here. It's pretty cool. Give it a chance. All right. Bye for real. I'll be back next week.
Prepare for light speed.